One of my favorite non-biblical sayings, quotes, axioms, if you will, comes from Henry David Thoreau. It says this: most men live lives of quiet desperation. It's one of my favorites because, it's kind of sad. Is there more to this life? Quiet desperation. I get up, trudge to work, trudge to the next thing, all the while wondering, is there more to this life? Jesus talks about that, right? We've been talking about it for the last several weeks. Taking hold of the life that is truly life. Welcome to week 4 of our Abundance series. Here's the whole quote. The mass of men live lives of quiet desperation. What is called resignation is confirmed desperation. This is the exact opposite of abundance, what we want to lean into today as we look at biblical examples that we can lean into what they model on how to live this abundant life that Jesus has called us toward. Today we're looking at King David, and I can't hardly wait for that. But each week we've been talking about the themes that we talked about last year, a year ago. You just heard Pastor Tony mention this commitment card. Would you go ahead and grab that? If you don't have it in your hand yet, maybe pull it out, sit it on your lap. There should be a pin tucked in with it. If you would go ahead and the very bottom of page 3, there's a space to put your name and email and phone number, just a way for us to encourage you and to follow up with you and maybe give you records later on for this. Go ahead and fill that out, but if you would leave the top part, if you haven't already filled it out, blank, we'll put some information to that here in a few minutes. And while I'm talking today, maybe just leave this somewhere right there. Be praying. Maybe pick it out and hold it. Think about what's going to happen. At the end of this service, you're going to have a moment to respond. A year ago, almost to the date, we had a moment of declaration, a moment of commitment as we launched this New Life initiative. We're about halfway through right now. Almost a year ago to the day, we were all down front, those of us who call Venture our church home, and we were making a commitment and we were signing that wall right there. If you haven't noticed, it's been out in the lobby for the last year, but many of you, your signatures are on that wall. If you're brand new around here, well, maybe today is an opportunity for you to make your own commitment, a brand new commitment. And at the end of the service, I would invite you to come down here and sign your name on that wall. You are certainly a part of our Venture Christian Church family, and that space will be there at the end of the service. Some of us today, we're doubling down on our commitment. We are planning to finish strong. This is a reminder that I made a commitment to God a year ago, and I'm going to see that through. By God's grace, I'm going to see that commitment through over this next year. Some of us, maybe God has been prompting us that here's an opportunity to increase that gift. God, you've blessed me, or God, you've challenged me. God, you've been nudging me in a certain way over the last year or maybe over the last month. And it's an opportunity for you to increase that commitment. You'll have space and margin to do that at the end of the service. For the last year, we've been talking about New Life, that the primary goal is that God would do something in us long before he does something through us. And that's the secondary goal. He's doing some cool things through us. We've been celebrating some of the projects that our gifts have gone toward. But I keep hearing stories of how God's doing a thing in you. We're leaning into that today. The anchor verse or verses for this abundance series is 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 18, where Paul tells young Timothy. Ironically, last week, Caleb was preaching last week. Didn't he do an incredible job? Incredible weekend. I I watched his message. Nope, I need to say that differently. I listened to his message as I was driving across Missouri. I had YouTube open in the seat next to me, but I was listening, not watching. That would be illegal. I'm not confessing anything like that. But last Sunday, I was visiting a small country church in northern Missouri that's valuable to my childhood, my memories there when I was a kid. Would you believe that they're in the middle of a stewardship series there? And this was his anchor text for the day. And I was struck as I was seeing that up on the screen there in that little country church, that first word. It's not nudge. It's not encourage. It's not whisper. Paul's telling young Timothy, command the church that you get to lead. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life, not live lives of quiet desperation, but take hold of, well, Jesus talks about this when he says that the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but he says, I've come that they may have life and have it to the fullest. Another translation, I love it, says that they may have it more abundantly. Abundant life. Abundance. I've said it once, I'll say it again, that if you have Jesus, you have more than enough. There is abundant life for us as we lean into it. I want to put up a timeline if I can. We're talking about the adventurous life today, and I want to show you where this anchors in the series. For 4 weeks, we've been kind of skipping around through history, the story that God has been telling. Let me anchor this. Week 1, we talked about the early church. I even showed you a picture of the space where, in my opinion, the church was birthed, born. That day of Pentecost, Peter stood up and preached to a large assembly. Almost 3,000 are added to their number that day, and the church explodes, and they're living a life on fire for God. It's life on mission, and we see abundance displayed even in how they treat one another, how they love one another well, how they don't hold on to their stuff tightly, but they hold it loosely. They're on mission. Last week, Caleb talked about the humble life. We could have picked a whole bunch of different examples of this, but he talked about a tax collector, an opportunity to live the humble life. We're going to put that right about here on the timeline. We launched this series with the early church, but about 2 weeks ago, we talked about Father Abraham. We're putting him way on the end of that timeline. About 2,000 years before the time of Christ, there's Father Abraham, had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. And as we discovered, he lived the blessed life. We're blessed to be a blessing. Today, I want to spend some time right here. King David. King David lives the adventurous life, and oh my goodness, there's so many things we can talk about King David. I shared with you week 1 of this series a life verse of mine. It means so much to me that I printed it out and kind of matted it, and it's hung up in every office that I've served for the last, 15 years or so. It's this place where Paul is preaching in Pisidian Antioch in Acts chapter 13. And he has these words to say about the character we're looking at today. For when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep. He was buried with this is a euphemism for death. He was buried with his fathers and his body decayed. That's a weird verse to have as a life verse, right? Well, it reminds me that today is the day. This is the opportunity for this generation to seize the opportunities that God gives me. I want my life to be on display for God. I want to live a life of abundance, not for my edification, but for His glory. David does this. For a season, God used him. And then the legacy that he leaves behind, well, even you and I could learn something from him. Today, he's described in your Bible as a man after God's own heart. Can you imagine that being on your gravestone? A man or a woman after God's own heart, that when people look at your heart, they see that God is doing something in you, long before he does something through you. and that your heart resembles his heart. That's such a high compliment. That's such a high thing to aspire to live toward. There's so many ways that we could look at King David and we could see how he's a man after God's own heart. We could talk about his faith. We could. David's first and maybe his most well-known accomplishment was that defeat of the Philistine giant, Goliath. Do you remember this story? It takes courage to face a sword-wielding giant with nothing but a sling and a couple of rocks. But before throwing the stone that would take the giant down, well, let's look at what David says. 1 Samuel chapter 17, he's got the puny army of the Lord, the Israelites, behind him, and there's a whole bunch of giants, including these Philistines from Gath, Goliath, this champion, out in front of the army. And this is what David says: this entire assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will hand you over to us. This is faith on display. David is giving God credit for defeating Goliath before the giant was hit by the stone. It was through this faith that God empowered him to be successful. This giant killing faith remained with David his entire life. We could talk about his faith. We could also talk about his trust. Perhaps you remember that David was, the second king, right? You have another one before him. Saul is crowned king. Saul, here the scriptures describe him as ruddy and handsome, self-confident, a natural-born leader. But his heart got away from him. And he went quite mad, actually. He was throwing spears at David, trying to kill David. Saul was a constant threat to David's life. David had respect for him in the position he had as king, and he spared his life on, more than one occasion. David had the opportunity to sneak up and kill Saul in a cave. I've been there in that cave system. It's called En-Gedi. I snapped a picture of it. We see trust on display in this space. Perhaps you remember the story. Every time I read this story in the Bible, I go back to my middle school self, because Saul is going to the bathroom. David has the opportunity, I won't describe in detail what's going on there, but David has the opportunity to sneak up on him and end this conflict by taking Saul's life. He doesn't. He chose not to. This is what he said in 1 Samuel 24, "May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord take vengeance on you for me. Not by my hand shall this be done against you. As the proverb of the ancients says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you." David shows complete trust in God, which meant it was not in his hands to strike down the king, because God had put him in command. David knew that God had proclaimed David to be the next king, but unlike Saul and the way he was approaching that assignment, he would wait until God removed Saul rather than taking the matter into his own hands. It's trust. He was relying on God to save him from the wickedness of Saul, who sought to destroy him. As a man after God's own heart, this is an act of trust. We could talk about trust. It's also an extreme act of something else we could talk about that's on display in David's life that qualifies him as a man after God's own heart. It's the word love. In all of his dealings with Saul, David shows what the New Testament would describe as agape love, selfless love, a type of love toward the man who is determined to be his enemy. We just looked at a picture from En-Gedi. Let me anchor this in the text. This hideout when Saul is pursuing David to take his life. 1 Samuel chapter 23. So Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. Therefore, that place was called the Rock of Escape. David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. And it's interesting that this man, chosen by God and described as being after his own heart, did this centuries before Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And his command, which Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And here's David, a man after God's own heart, putting this on display about 1,000 years before Jesus speaks those words in the Sermon on the Mount. We could talk about love. We could also talk about humility as we look at him being a man after God's own heart. After experiencing remarkable success in battle, David remains humble. We could talk about his humility. For example, Saul offered his daughter, her name was Michal, to David as a wife. And look at David's response. I'm in 1 Samuel chapter 18. Is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law, since I am only a poor man and insignificant? By the way, when he says this, there'd already been some ticker tape parades thrown in his honor. But we see humility on display here. Later in his life, after David was crowned king and he had conquered his enemies, the prophet Nathan told him of God's promise to extend David's dynasty forever. And David prayed this beautiful prayer which shows humility. Who am I, Lord God, that you, and who are the members of my household that you have brought me this far? We see humility. We could talk about his humility. As we look at what qualifies him to be a man after God's own heart, we could talk about his integrity. He does some wrong things, but he admits when he's wrong. We could talk about his integrity. We could talk about forgiveness and the fact that not only did he give forgiveness, but he sought it as well. Later in life, perhaps you remember the story. It was at the time when kings are supposed to go out to war, and he looks down and he sees a beauty bathing on the roof, and, well, he commits adultery with a woman named Bathsheba. He doubles down on his sin, and he sends her husband, to be killed in battle. The prophet Nathan comes to David and confronts him in his sin, and instead of making excuses for his behavior, come on, he's the king. He can do what he wants, right? Look at how he responds in 2 Samuel chapter 12. I have sinned against the Lord. And then he pins Psalm 51, and he displays seeking forgiveness in the beautiful words of that psalm. We have so many reasons why we could explore David as a man after God's own heart. I mean, he's the king. He has a bunch of different job descriptions, right? I mean, he's the CAO. He's the chief administrative officer. The buck stops at the king's desk. He's the CMO. He's the chief military officer, right? He's the one at the head of the army going after the enemies of God and God's people. He's the CWO. He's the chief worship officer. Several times we see him leading the entire nation in moments of worship, declaring God's worth. We could look at that, but today we're going to focus on his worship through the word stewardship. David is the CSO. He's the chief stewardship officer of the nation. We're going to dive into an aspect of David's life that's often overlooked, but it's incredibly relevant, I think, to us today. It's this idea of financial stewardship. The abundant life that David gets to live. Oh, we can trace it back to his financial stewardship. I know what you might be thinking. Money and faith, can we talk about those things together? We can, and we should. Jesus has an awful lot to say about money. Because when we look at David's life, we see not just a king who fought battles and played the harp, but a leader who understood the adventurous, abundant life that comes from honoring God with his resources. David's story teaches us that financial stewardship isn't just about saving or giving. It's about recognizing where it all comes from in the first place. It's about living with a perspective that transforms how we use what we have, whether we're in abundance or even when we're in want. So I've got 5 principles for you. 5 abundance principles. If you're taking notes, you might want to write these down. These all come from the life of David. Here's the first one. Recognize the source. When you think about your bank account, When you think about your investment portfolio, when you think about the stuff that you've accumulated through the years, do you recognize the source, the very foundation of stewardship? David does. He understands this deeply. We see his own words in Psalm 24, verse 1, when he says this, "The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it. All of this, it's God's, the world, and all who live in it. Everything is God's." Those are David's words. That's a powerful statement. And David's life is marked by a profound understanding that everything, as the king, his kingdom, as the king, his wealth, as the king, his victories, as the shepherd boy, those quiet moments of, as Caleb was talking about earlier, walking through the valley of the shadow of death, everything, well, it belongs to God. It's his. In 1 Chronicles chapter 29, as David was preparing the resources for the building of the temple, what we know as Solomon's temple, he said this in verses 11 and 12. Check this out. He said, "Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor. For everything in heaven and earth, well, it's yours. It's yours. Wealth and honor comes from you. You are the ruler of all things." David's perspective on wealth was grounded in this simple yet profound truth. It's all God's. He's the source. Could we seek to apply that together today? How would our financial decisions change if we truly believed that everything we have is God's? The first step in living an abundant life marked by financial stewardship is shifting our mindset from ownership. It's me, mine, my stuff. From ownership to stewardship. When we see ourselves as stewards, well, we're just managing what God has entrusted to us. We're not accumulating or hoarding it for ourselves. If you're taking notes, that's the first abundance principle. Here's the second. We're called to put generosity into action. Put it into action. David leads this by example. He understands that God is the source, and this impacts what he does. It impacts his actions. David desperately wants to build a temple for God. So he gathers the whole nation together. We get a snapshot in what had to be a glorious moment during David's reign and rule. I'm in 1 Chronicles chapter 28. By the way, I'm excited this fall. The second Gladiator movie is coming out. Oh my goodness, I loved the first one, the whole Braveheart era. I'm excited about maybe taking one of my boys to see that, and that's going to be cool. David's story is better. It's an epic story of adventure. If you have never read it, could I point you toward 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, to name a few places in your Old Testament. And maybe even this next several days, this is the Thanksgiving time of year, read his story. This is an epic moment in his story. Chapter 28, verse 2, King David rose to his feet and said, "Listen to me, my fellow Israelites, my people." He's the king. They listened. "I had it in my heart to build a house as a place of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord, for the footstool of our God." I want to build God a home, a place to be. "And I made plans to build it, a place for us to worship him. But God said to me, 'You're not to build a house for me, for my name.'" Why? Because you're a warrior and you've shed blood. This is somebody else's job. The next chapter, chapter 29, verse 3, David says this. He's talking about how all in to this dream he is. "Besides, in my devotion to the temple of my God, I now give my personal treasures of gold and silver for the temple of my God, over and above everything I have provided for this holy temple." Listen, David wasn't just giving from the royal treasury here. He was giving from his personal wealth. And it wasn't just a token amount, it was substantial. Actually, We're getting ready to read all the gifts that are given that day. I did a little bit of math. You're talking about 5,600 tons in total. This is 11,200,000 pounds of precious materials. To put it into context today, this would be loaded dump trucks. Each one can hold 50,000 pounds. This would be 224 fully loaded dump trucks. Well, let's read it together. 1 Chronicles chapter 29, besides my devotion to the temple of God, I now give my personal treasures of gold and silver for the temple of my God, over and above everything I have provided for his holy temple. Why did David give so generously? Because he knew that true financial stewardship is marked by generosity, and not just generosity that's calculated, but generosity that's sacrificial and joyful. Then King David said to the whole assembly, my son Solomon, the one whom God has chosen, is young and inexperienced. Let's set him up well. The task is great because this palatial structure is not for man, but for the Lord God. With all my resources, I've provided for the temple of my God, gold for the goldwork, silver for the silver, bronze for the bronze, iron for the iron, wood for the wood, as well as onyx for the settings, turquoise, stones of various colors. He's painting a picture. All kinds of fine stone and marble, all of these in large quantities. What did I say? 224 dump trucks. Besides, in my devotion to the temple of my God, I now give my personal treasures of gold and silver for the temple of my God, over and above everything I have provided for his holy temple. 3,000 talents of gold, 7,000 talents of refined silver for the overlaying of the walls and the building, for the gold work and the silver work, and for all the work that is done by the craftsmen. Now, who else is with me? Who else is willing to consecrate themselves to the Lord today? By the way, David's abundant generosity, it was contagious. It was catching. People caught the vision. They responded in devotion to the Lord their God. Then the leaders of families, the officers of the tribes of Israel, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, and the officials in charge of the king's work gave willingly. They gave toward the work on the temple of God 5,000 talents, 10,000 derricks of gold, 10,000 talents of silver, 18,000 talents of bronze, 100,000 talents of iron. Anyone who had precious stones gave them to the treasury of the temple of the Lord in the custody of some guy who I can't even pronounce his name, but he's in the Bible. Can you imagine being entrusted with 224 dump trucks full of precious material for a building project for God? What's the application for us? Generosity isn't just about the act of giving. It's about the heart behind it. God wants to do a work in us so he can do a work through us. Last week, I liked the phrase that Caleb kept using, describing the Pharisees: too much head, not enough heart. The abundant life that God calls us to live is not one where we cling tightly to what we have, but where we open our hands and we open our hearts to give freely. When's the last time that you gave in such a way that stretched you, made you trust God more deeply? Here's another abundance principle from the life of David. Multiply abundance. There's a reward to stewardship. We see it happen in David's life. He shows us that generosity leads to abundance, not necessarily in material possessions, although maybe, but definitely in joy, in purpose, in legacy. Don't forget the outcome of David's generosity. Look at 1 Chronicles 29. His actions inspired others. The people rejoiced at the willing response of their leaders, for they'd given freely and wholeheartedly to the Lord. David's heart for giving set the tone for an entire nation. This is the important part. The abundant life isn't just about personal blessing. It's about how our stewardship impacts others and, more importantly, glorifies God. David's willingness to give of his resources, it sparks a chain reaction of worship and generosity. So what if? What if our financial choices could inspire others, maybe in our family or our community, maybe even our workplace? Stewardship that reflects God's heart, well, it has a multiplying effect. Our decisions about money are more significant than we might think. They have the opportunity and the potential to inspire, to set an example, and to lead others in worship. I said there are five abundance principles. Here's the fourth. Stewardship is for all times, including the challenging ones. We can learn this from David's leadership. David's journey wasn't free from hardship. Neither is ours. There's this moment, Saul is fighting him. They get to this town called Ziklag, and they find that their city has been raided. Their family is taken. Can you imagine this? Their possessions looted. In the middle of this crisis, David's response, well, let's look at it. 1 Samuel 30, verse 6. David found strength in the Lord his God. And once he received direction from God, he and the men pursued the enemy. They recovered what was lost. They gained even more. But here's the part that I love. David didn't keep everything he recovered for himself and for those men. In 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 24, we see that he establishes a principle that those who stayed behind to guard supplies would share in the plunder equally. David was fair and he was generous, even in the midst of adversity. So how do we apply that? Well, how do we steward our resources when times are tough? The abundant life of stewardship isn't just about how we manage plenty. It's also about how we handle scarcity. David's example shows us that true stewardship means seeking God's wisdom, acting justly, and sharing what we have even when it feels risky. There's a dear couple in our church. We've been sharing these stories, these new life stories each week during this abundance series. I love this story. I'm not going to tell it. I'm going to invite Dick and Deb Pritchard to share their amazing story. Check this out.
We're Dick and Deb Pritchard. We've been going to Adventure Church for about 3 years.
I work in children's ministry. I'm involved in the preschool. I teach 3-year-olds on Monday and Wednesday, and I also teach the 2-year-old class in Sunday school.
I'm also in children's ministry. I'm working at the check-in desk. We've always been excited about children's ministry. The future, as I look at the youth and young families coming into the children's ministry, it's an exciting place to be. We were very excited to see how the church was going to bless the community and engage the community. When it came to making a commitment, Deb and I talked about it, prayed about it, and made our commitment with no idea what the next 12 months was going to look like. And all of a sudden, we got to April, and I went to a baseball game, and I dropped dead.
Was sick that morning, not able to go to the baseball game, and fell asleep and got awoken by my cell phone. Looked down, it was our son Rob, and told me that Dad had collapsed and he had no pulse and was not breathing. He described many people coming alongside and forming a CPR line, and there was an EMT that was coaching the line, and then he said, I need to go, and I'll call you later. I don't know what I thought. I just was in shock and wondering what to do next and who to call and what to do. And then the phone rang again. It was Rob again. He said, Mom, he's breathing. Dad's alive. They got a pulse.
4 hours later, I woke up. God put the right people there for me to bring me back, to have nurses and cardiologists there right at the baseball game. When we started learning about New Life, in my mind, it was more about what the church was going to do, a new life for the church. And as I went through the whole year, and especially my episode in April, I was very very convinced that God had a plan for a new life for each of us, not just for the church. It's been exciting to watch the construction outside and to see as it's coming close to a completion, but then I keep thinking it's not complete. This is just the beginning of God's plan for the church. Ephesians 2:10, we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works that are planned in advance by God for us to do. I have complete faith God will put people in the right place just like he put them in the right place on April the 20th. Every morning I thank God for those blessings and that we can share those blessings with others.
To stay strong in our commitment is not a big challenge when we take the time to pray, ask the Holy Spirit to just give you those nudges and let you know where you should use your resources.
Continuing to listen to God. I know what we need to do. You know, it's my plan. And I keep thinking, no, it's not my plan, it's God's plan. To do that, I've got to give up control. And that's really hard for me to do.
Ditto. Thank you, Dick, and thank you, Deb, for sharing that story. You talk about new life. I love that. We've been using a metaphor through this. It's been subtle, but maybe you've caught. There's a bit of an agrarian theme here. Week 1, I talked about how we planted some seeds last fall. God seeks to do a work in us. And we're beginning to see some of the things he's doing a work through us. We're beginning to see some of the harvest of righteousness. We're expecting more harvest in years to come as we continue to double down on planting. I told you there are five abundance principles that we can pull from David's life. Here's the last one if you're taking notes. Leave a legacy. This is David's heart on display, to leave a legacy long after he's gone. Remember my life verse for this generation. David served God's purposes in his generation, but financial stewardship that he puts on display, well, he leaves a legacy that lasts long after he's gone. Look at his heart on display here in 1 Chronicles chapter 29. He says this, pray unto God. Keep these desires and thoughts in the hearts of your people forever. God seeks to do a work in us. Hearts. And keep their hearts loyal to you. Give my son Solomon the wholehearted devotion to keep your commands, your statutes, and decrees. And to do everything to build the palatial structure for which I have provided. God's going to do a work in us, and then he does a work through us. You see that modeled even right there in that beautiful prayer. David's prayer shows that he understood stewardship as a long-term investment into God's kingdom. It wasn't just about what he could achieve in his lifetime, but about what he could set into motion for the future. How about you? What kind of a financial legacy are we leaving behind? Stewardship isn't just about today, it's about tomorrow. Are we teaching our kids and those who we influence what it means to be generous and wise stewards? Are we investing in things that matter, that will outlast us, that have the potential to point others toward God? Would you pull out that commitment card that we referenced earlier? We're going to have a moment of response here. You heard Dick and Deb reference a year ago a commitment that they made. Many of you remember that moment when you signed this wall. You made a commitment to God. This is just simply an opportunity to, well, remember that, to acknowledge that, to listen to God as, well, he tells you what he's calling you to do. Some of you are brand new around here. Could I put the card up here on the screen? I want to explain this card to you a little bit. If you're new around here and you're choosing to engage in this new life initiative, this is the space that you're going to fill out. If you were a part of that moment that I just described a year ago, well, this is your space right here. And if you recall what you committed last year, you can write that number down, or you could just simply write down, I don't recall right now, but that there is for you. And then you're going to respond one of these two boxes. I'm going to confirm my commitment to finish strong. I made a goal, a commitment last year. I'm going to follow through on that commitment. Or maybe God's been whispering and nudging your heart, and you're going to check the other box. I'm going to increase my 2-year commitment to this amount. God's calling me to do it. I'm simply seeking to be obedient in response. And then I'm going to get us going here in a moment. I'm going to invite you to pray. If you're here with your spouse, it would be a good time maybe for you to bow your head and to close your eyes with them. And the two of you whisper a prayer together and make sure you're in one accord on this decision. I'm going to invite you to pray, and then when the time is right, when you feel God move in your heart, it's time to make that commitment, you're going to come up here and you're going to drop your commitment card in one of these boxes here. We've got some back there as well. While you're up here, we've got a glow stick. I would invite you to grab that and crack that open. We'll explain more of that later. By the way, if you're a first-time guest today, well, you picked a weekend to join us here at Venture, didn't you? This moment probably isn't for you. This is for a moment that it's those of us who call Venture their church home. But I would invite you to join us as well. You don't need to drop a commitment card in if God's not leading you that way. But would you grab one of those glow sticks? You crack it open as well, because I want you to join in the moment that we're all going to enjoy together here in a moment. I'm going to pray. I'm going to get us started. But before I do that, could I point out that timeline we looked at earlier? We talked about Father Abraham. I'm blessed to be a blessing. David, the adventurous life that he's called me toward. We talked about the tax collector and the humble life, this abundant life, and the early church that was launched. Well, what's this? It's me. It's you. Those place, events, space has so much value to look at. Father Abraham, well, do you remember we talked about this? There's a moment where God calls him to be faithful, calls him to a moment of sacrifice on Mount Moriah, his only son, the child of the promise. You're blessed to be a blessing. Abraham is faithful. He names the place, the Lord will provide. God provides a ram in the thicket. There's this moment where David, the space that Solomon's going to build the temple, well, David buys that from a guy who owns it. It's a threshing floor. It's the same space that Abraham, in my opinion, was at in that moment of sacrifice. David makes this statement, I'm not going to give God that which costs me nothing. The guy had offered just to give it to him. He's the king, after all. David says, no. I'm going to buy it. This is for God. I'm not going to give God something that costs me nothing. The early church, in my opinion, is birthed from that same space. We talked about this week 1, the southern steps of the temple. 3,000 are added to their number that day, the day of Pentecost, and the church goes out and the church does its thing. And you and I were several generations downstream of that moment today, but that sets in motion something that you and I are a part of today. The abundant life. Would you bow your heads? Would you close your eyes? I'll get us started. I'm going to pray, you pray, and then when the time is right, you come forward and respond.